to the 25th annual, the closing session of the 25th annual Temple Beth El Comparative Religion. Tracy, this is the closing session, yes? Yeah, yes, the closing session of the 25th annual 25th annual Comparative Religion series at Temple Beth El. Hey, only 75 more of these to go till we get to our centenary, right? I mean, hang on for that. We have an exciting array of speakers tonight who Neckman's Ladane Pulaski will now introduce without further discussion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's always good to see you, at least your little boxes with your names in them or your faces. So welcome. It's been a really exciting series. It's been a lot of fun, and I think tonight will be no different. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm very, very excited. We have two really super cool people with us, and I can't wait to hear them. Brittany Hunt is probably wondering like what she's done, because like this is the third time she's been on Zoom with me in the last 2 weeks. So I've just recently gotten to know her. She's really wonderful. She is a member of the Lumbee tribe. She has received her PhD in curriculum and instruction at UNC Charlotte, or Charlotte, as we're supposed to call it these days. She has a BA from Duke and a Master of Social Work from UNC Chapel Hill. So you've really kind of got the trifecta there.
And I worked at NC State for 2 years too. So
okay,
yeah.
wow, okay, you got it all.
Yeah.
So she developed and operated the American Indian Urban Education Division at Urban Education Collaborative. Her research interests include the experiences of American Indian students in education, and specifically how the K-12 system disenfranchises Native history in the classroom and those effects on American consciousness and Native cultural identity. For those of you for whom this is important, she's in Slytherin House. I happen to know this. And if that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. You don't need to know that for the purposes of tonight. I've just recently gotten to know her, as I mentioned, and I'm just so impressed by the passion and the knowledge that she brings. And I'm personally very, very excited to hear from her tonight. We also have with us tonight Charlie Lowry, who is a musician from Pembroke, North Carolina, part of the Lumbee and Tusk Aurora tribes. As she was teaching me earlier how to say that correctly. She describes herself as an artivist, which I love. I'm guessing that's art and activist together. She raises awareness around issues that plague underdeveloped and underserved communities. She has an established career as a singer-songwriter. She has toured extensively internationally. She's a lead singer and recording artist with the multi-award-winning band Dark Water Rising. She's collaborated with numerous artists, bands, and organizations, and served as executive director of Peace in the Park. Her life is about using her music career in ways that increase Indigenous visibility on a global scale, revitalizing and preserving culture while exploring genres of world, soul, country, folk, blues, rocks, and roots music. You may have seen her on American Idol, where she did incredibly well, did us all proud for North Carolina. And one of the things that she shares in her bio is that in her community, women are traditionally barred from playing the drum, and she defies that norm, following in the footsteps of her mentor, Pura Fay, choosing to battle with her song, storytelling, hand drum, and guitar to deliver performances that not only tell the plight of her people, but of all humankind, all people that face oppression. And she mentions that Robeson County, her home, is one of the most diverse counties in the US, and she celebrates the diversity of those southern rural swamps in all aspects of her life. She says that she serves as a voice for her ancestors as well as the youth of today, and remains committed to music that honors roots and lives vibrantly in the here and now. So as you can tell, these are two amazing, accomplished women, and we are very delighted to hear from them tonight. So I'm going to call on Brittany to go first. They'll each share for about 15 minutes, and then as usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. and we will get to as many as we can. So Brittany, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I hope everybody's doing really well tonight. So as she mentioned, my name is Brittany Hunt. I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. I also currently work at Duke University, so I'm videoing in from Durham tonight, but I primarily live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am again, from the Lumbee tribe. We primarily reside in Robeson County, North Carolina, which is on the southeastern border of North Carolina and South Carolina. It's just about a 20-minute drive to South Carolina, to Dillon, if y'all are familiar with that. And it's about a 30 or 45-minute drive to Fayetteville, North Carolina. So that just helps to give you some context to where Robeson County specifically is. So I grew up in the part of the Lumberton that I'm from is from West 5th Street. If y'all are familiar with that, most of you probably are not. And most of my family are, I would say, follow a very evangelical form of Christianity. I remember when I went away to college, someone said, Native Americans aren't Christians. And I remember being like, well, what was I doing all my life then? Because I was at church every Wednesday night, every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, always for Vacation Bible School. And also in my specific form of Christianity, I'm from the Church of God religion, if y'all are familiar with that. It's pretty similar to Pentecostalism. So it's a very charismatic form of Christianity. But we had something called camp meetings and tent meetings once a year, and you would meet in these big tents, and all the people from the Church of God religion in the county would kind of congregate together, and there would be music and preaching, and it was just kind of a big event for our particular form of Christianity in the county. And so I grew up in a way where Christianity kind of shaped who I was, shaped my identity as an Indigenous person, but also was a very major part of my family. So my grandfather, on my maternal grandfather, was a preacher. And then my paternal grandfather had a big role in the church as well. He was the church treasurer. And then my grandmother was obviously a preacher's wife, my maternal grandmother. And then my mother was kind of raised as being a preacher's kid, and she identifies very much as being a preacher's kid. And in the Pentecostal faith at that time, or in the Church of God faith at that time, women were not allowed to wear pants, or it was very frowned upon for them to wear pants. And so my mother wore skirts up until she was 22 years old. She could not cut her hair. She couldn't get her ears pierced. Going to the movies was considered a sin. Going to the beach was considered a sin. And so she grew up with this very rigid and very strict form of Christianity that was kind of limiting for her. She feels it was kind of a major limitation for her in kind of her identity development. And so even though when she had me, she tried to not be so limiting, she still was considered very strict. She's a very, very, very strict parent. She would not identify that with being a strict parent, but she definitely was compared to my friends' parents, and especially when I went away, compared to my peers who were not Native, compared to their parents as well. And so the way I experienced Lumbee Christianity was, again, a very charismatic form of Christianity, and also a very strict form of Christianity that in some ways was freeing and in other ways was not. And so that's kind of the way that I experienced it growing up. I think for a lot of people, it would be confusing to hear that a Native American went to a church like that, or even that Native Americans are Christian in general, like I shared earlier with the student who was shocked that Natives were a part of a Christian faith, right? But actually the largest Native American Christian church in the U.S. is in North Carolina, and it's in Robeson County, where Charlie and I are from. It's called Prospect United Methodist Church, and so they're part of the Methodist faith, and I think they have more than 700 members. And so that's the largest Native American population within a Christian church. And so there are a lot of Native people in North Carolina and in the South in general who identify very strongly with being Christian. And so it's a very important part, I would say, of Lumbee identity in general. In the 1800s and early 1900s, Lumbee government, Lumbee government has always existed, but it was kind of in the fledgling stages of forming in the context of the new government regime, which is now known as the United States. And so the church or the church house was a very important part of how our identities were being formed. And so where you went to church was important. There's a few different questions that Lumbee people always ask each other when they meet another Lumbee person. The first is always, who's your people? And so Lumbees very much want to contextualize a person and understand, who are you? Do I know someone who you know? Are we potentially related? You know, do I know your cousin Becky Jane, or maybe I'm kin to you through your Uncle Earl? And so Lumbees will ask, who's your people? That's the first question, and that helps establish kinship or relationality. Like, how do I know you? Who do you know who I know? And then one of the second or maybe even third questions that they'll ask is, where do you church? And so they'll ask it in a variety of ways. Where do you church? Where does your family go to church? But how my family primarily asked this was, what's your home church? And so I don't know if others have this kind of concept of a home church, but my home church would be considered Hestertown Church of God, or what is now called the Rock Church of God. And so even if I never go to that church again and I decide to go to a different church, that church would still be considered my home church, and where I was kind of raised, and the church I was raised in, and a church that was really important to me as a child. And so the concept of a home church is something that I haven't really heard outside of Robeson County that I think is important, and also kind of goes to another point of, whenever I tell someone I'm going home, it means I'm going to Robeson County. Even if I never live there again, that is forever my home. And so even though I live in Charlotte, and I do consider that my home to a certain extent, whenever I say I'm going home, it means I'm going to Robeson County. And so this idea of a home church, and then this idea of Robeson County being my forever home, are kind of tethered together, I think. And I think that's a really important point to make, to kind of understand, because for Indigenous people, land is so critical to who we are, and home is so important to who we are. I remember in college, I would go home every weekend at first. And I know a lot of college students do that, but then even after I got used to being away from home, I was still going home every other week. And then now I go every month, which I think is more than the average person would go and travel home to see their family. And so that's something that people are like, why would you go so much? So that's so much driving. But to me, I have this ancestral need to be connected with my family and to be close to them. And so that is also bound up in church. And so when I pack my bag to go home for the weekend, again, even though I live in Charlotte, I'll pack church clothes. And so even thinking about the pandemic, and thinking about past pandemics. So the Spanish flu of 1918 was a major, it majorly impacted Indigenous communities, because Indigenous peoples are so concerned with connecting together, or not concerned, that's not the right word, or connection is so important to who we are as a people. And so the Spanish flu was really devastating to Indigenous people. And then we see that happening 100 years later with now the COVID-19 pandemic being a major, major, major impact to Indigenous communities all across the state, and especially the Lumbee community where I'm from. And we see the churches not necessarily, I guess, abiding with state laws, or finding workarounds to state laws with mask mandates and things. And so we see the ways that connecting, even though it's been a major benefit to us historically, is now causing us harm in certain ways. And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the power of connection for good and for bad as well. Also, I think another important point to bring up is, I mentioned earlier that my mom was not allowed to wear skirts and to go to the movies and do all these kind of things that a lot of people consider to be very normal activities. She grew up, she was born in Baltimore, Maryland. A lot of Lumbees moved to Baltimore in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and a lot of Native people in general moved during that era. It's known as the Relocation Era. So a lot of Natives moved from their tribal communities to bigger cities. Baltimore is one. There's a major Lumbee population in Baltimore now. Philadelphia was one, New York, Detroit as well. And so she lived in Baltimore for a short period of time, but my family, my grandparents lived there for about 10 years or so. And there was a cultural center there at the time, and they had a powwow. And my family did not go to the powwow because that was considered anti-Christian. And I even hear some Native people, but most specifically Lumbee people, who believe that powwows or Native American traditional or cultural dancing is a sin or it's of the devil. And we see that historically throughout time, when settlers came over from Europe and they saw the way Indigenous people worshiped, or the way they viewed divinity, or the way they viewed the creator, was something that was bad or evil. And so over time, Native people were forced to be Christian. And so I think a lot of Native people have difficulties with reconciling that Christianity was introduced to us in violent ways, but also seeing it as a very important part of our culture and who we are today. And so I could not imagine myself not having grown up in the church, because it was such an important part of my life growing up. But at the same time, I see the ways that it impacted my mother, with her not being able to attend powwows or thinking that things like that were bad. And she doesn't think that way now, but I know a lot of Native elders, unfortunately, do believe that way. And again, it's these belief systems that the way we lived, or the way we worshiped, or the way we spoke our language is something that something was wrong with us, and that instead these things had to be replaced with Christianity, or with English, or with European style clothes or dress. And so we see this kind of uprooting of Native culture and replacing of European culture. And so I think that, again, a lot of Native people grapple with this idea of Christianity being something that maybe is a source of strength for our people now, but it definitely was not that 200 or 300 or 400 years ago. And so I think that's an important point to think about for tonight. And I can go ahead and yield now to Charlie, if you'd like to speak.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Brittany, I enjoyed that. My experience is very similar, because we pretty much grew up in communities that are probably 10 minutes apart from one another. And I wrote mine in my presentation and what I wanted to share in the form of like a story paper type deal that I wanted to share with you. And as we say in church, before we get up and sing or anything, y'all bear with me. Bear with me. But I love both the Lord and the Creator equally. I believe it imperative to let folks alone as it pertains to their religious beliefs or lack thereof until it crosses the line of taking lives. Each person has been gifted with a special opportunity to walk in and develop their relationship with their higher power of their choice. And I don't believe in forcing one's religion onto another or condemning them for believing one way or the other. It's not our job as human beings to do so. We are inferior at the end of the day. My religious outlook was cultivated before I came into this world. As an artist, I am merely a vessel of a higher power, and my path has been a very clear one. I am very thankful and feel blessed to have this kind of clarity as it pertains to the moral compass that I use on a daily basis. It's a sweet mix of red and blue. The red road of my Indigenous ancestors and all of our relations, and as blue as the sky, representing the heavenly covenant between God and all creation. When I was a junior in high school, I wrote a poem about the dichotomy that existed in the marriage between my mother and father, comparing and contrasting the two of them. Essentially, their spirits to the seasons of winter and spring. At the time, I didn't give much credence to how much their ways of being were also characterized by their upbringings and individual walks with Christ. And this is very similar to what Brittany was saying about her mother and her upbringing. My mother, a Christian woman, was gentle in her ways, very nurturing, hardworking, filled with grace, patience, obedience, and love. And she represented the light of spring. My father, in contrast, represented the bleakness of winter. He's a Lumbee man as well. And although he is filled with love and has a funny, sparse way of expressing it, he is also filled with disdain, fire, profanity, and sometimes revenge. Both of them oozing with passion and both navigating through the world with a moral compass that really points in the direction of good. They're both wonderful people, good people. For them, right is right, wrong is wrong. My mama was she was more turn the other cheek, and daddy was more I'll bust your cheeks. Growing up well and into adulthood, I spent more time with my mother. She was born and raised in a Christian household. Her and her 6 brothers grew up in the pews on Sunday morning and on Wednesday night Bible studies at our Holiness Methodist Church, which is seated in the center of our tribal community. No less than 100 yards away sits the Baptist Church that is also seated in the center of our tribal community. So which one was true center? I often ask myself that growing up. Is one better than the other? How did this come to be that 2 churches were so close together, with most of our community members engaging with one another on a daily basis, breaking bread together at Fran's, which is one of our local mom and pop's restaurants, attending school together, attending vacation Bible school together? I was always conflicted with what did they believe that we didn't believe. The funny thing though about Robeson County, Brittany mentioned, she touched on this, is that I can promise you won't drive no more than 7 to 10 miles without running into a church that's a Baptist, Methodist, Holiness, Pentecostal, or a denomination with a combination thereof. A church on every corner, as we like to say. And a quick Google search revealed that there are 181 churches in Robeson County, but I feel like there may be more than that. And a quick Google search will also reveal that as a county, we are the largest county in the state by land area, and also have the largest population of Native Americans in the state, whom of most identify as members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. And so as a young Lumbee girl, I grew up following my mama to church, dressed up in the frilliest of handmade dresses that were sewn by my grandma, Grandma Eula. And she made a living as a seamstress, with 95% of her clientele belonging to one congregation or another. So women would come from miles away to purchase fabric or one of Grandma's signature ruffled dresses for their little girl or adolescent girls. And so going to our church was like going to a fashion show with Grandma Eula as the lead designer. And at any rate, because Mama and I tended to miss church from time to time, I loved preaching more than I did Sunday school, because my Sunday school class would give me the devil about messing up the attendance roster and thereby causing us to miss out on the chance to hang the attendance banner on display in our classroom. And I've always been the eccentric type, which caused my ruffle dresses and tights combos that I would put together to be, to cause the class to laugh and get a good giggle, and what I like to call holy bullying. So I felt like I was being bullied because of my choice of outfits. So a combination of my attendance mishaps with my fashion forwardness were a few of the key ingredients in a recipe for my ability to thrive in the sanctuary. So I love the sanctuary. Gospel music was the star for me. And from an early age, the music of church just sat well with my soul. My grandfather first placed me in front of the congregation when I was about 4 years old. And one of my most vivid memories was singing the Bible up north in a church located in Warren, Michigan. Brittany mentioned that we had pockets of Lumbee folks in Michigan, was one of the places. We often visited and vacationed in Detroit with my grandfather because some of his best friends lived there, Jimmy and Letha Strickland. And they were Lumbee, and the pastor was Preacher Bozo. And so we'd visit his church, and they gave me the honor of being one of their featured vocalists. And I've always felt right at home at any church for that reason. I knew that I could always make a joyful noise and that it would be pleasing to the Lord. The church has been very instrumental in developing my artistry. And speaking of the Red Road that I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was also the one who took me to annual powwows in our community. In terms of culture and tradition, I would agree with Brittany and say that the settler colonizers have done a wonderful job of assimilating our people as it pertains to religion. Our people are of very strong faith. Faith and education are the cornerstones of many of our families. But attending powwows, though, and winning the distinguished title of Junior Miss Lumbee back in 1997-98 opened my eyes to a form of spirituality that existed before our people were colonized. It was then that I was introduced to the Creator. I received the Lord as my personal Savior in 97 as a 13-year-old girl, but I also embraced the teachings and ways of living with all of my relations around the same time. Seemed like a portal opened up for me, and my faith multiplied exponentially. I was introduced to the concept of walking in two worlds. It's a way of living that embraces Christianity and modern ways of living while simultaneously carrying on traditional ways and beliefs of our ancestors. An example of this would be embracing do unto others as you would have them do unto you in Christian faith, with others mainly referring to human beings. When we say do unto others, we're mainly talking about people. In conjunction with the concept of all of my relations, the Red Road treats all relations as the land, the water, the animal kingdom, the trees, the stars, the skies, brethren and sistren, with all the same amount of dignity and respect that I would hope for in return. You take care of the universe, and the universe will take care of you, in a sense. So serving as Junior Miss Lumbee when I was a teenager gave me the opportunity, and that was one of the first times that I really traveled out away from my church, traveled out away from our community, and visited various denominations throughout the state and beyond. So now, instead of worshiping and fellowshipping with Indigenous folks, I was visiting Black and white congregations of various denominations. And I wouldn't say that I was shocked, but I was more relieved to find that we all have more in common than we do in differences in our beliefs. It was around the age of 14 that my mother and I stopped attending our home church, mainly for political reasons and just people being people. You know, church is a place for worship and fellowship, but sometimes it's inundated with gossiping and favoritism. And so I began to watch an evolution as my mother began using her usual church time. She used it to tend the land, not in a working way, but in a way that brought her peace and brought her closer to Mother Earth. And between that and using that time to prepare Sunday dinner for our family, I saw that as a window of time for reverence and worship. And because I began making a name for myself as a vocalist, I was often asked to visit other churches. And so I was usually, you know, if I wasn't at home with her, I was still in church somewhere, usually singing. Fast forward to my college years, the summer before I entered college at UNC Chapel Hill, our summer reading requirement was to read the Quran. And I absolutely loved it. I love the similarities between the Bible and the Quran, with love seated at the center of both texts. And for the record, I don't claim to be a Bible aficionado, and honestly, I can't remember if I read the Quran in its entirety. But again, the Red Road is one that teaches you to respect every living thing, because at the end of the day, Mother Nature rules supreme. As an adult, the the past decade has been very eye-opening and enlightening for me in terms of peeling back the many layers of historical trauma that comes with the genocide and cover-up of a people. I have witnessed my father's side of the family take part in traditions that have direct correlations to Tusk Aurora creation stories. And if you're not familiar with the Tusk Aurora, before the 1700s, they were a large stronghold in eastern North Carolina. They were one of the largest tribes and one of the strongest in terms of, you know, taking care of their territory and power. And so there are stories of Lumbee and Tuscarora being the same people, coming from the same people, having very similar histories. And I've watched this overlapping inside of my family in terms of our spirituality and spiritual practices. An example being killing the snake and then proceeding to hang it up in a tree with the belief that it'll bring rain in a few days. And that's something that I grew up watching my father do, and he still does it to this day. Research and creation stories tells us that this was an ancient practice believed to have been done as a way of pleasing the thunder beings, almost the equivalent of a rain dance. So my father, he's done this, like I said, as long as I can remember, but he had no clue as to where it came from. He had no clue why he done it or where he got it from. It's just something that he saw his father do, his grandfather do. And this is the kind of knowledge and spiritual traditions that have survived centuries of attempts to eradicate our people. This example alone assures me that it's okay to have love for our Lord and love for the Creator. I mean, what were our people supposed to do? What were they really supposed to do? My mother, I love her so much. I lost her to breast cancer in 2014, and I fight my own personal health battles. I received my second kidney transplant in April of 2020 after spending 4 years on dialysis while my mother was receiving her chemotherapy treatments. So it was a very challenging time for me, a very challenging season. My spiritual walk has been challenged, and it's made me better because of it. I pray more consistently, give gratitude, and interact with people differently now. I place more value upon time spent with Mother Earth and in solitude. Life is short. We can read religious texts that have been documented for centuries upon centuries, but the truth is that we are here and then we're gone in the blink of an eye. And so while I'm here, I just want to thank you for allowing me to share a bit of my perspective, and thank you for reaching out to us as Indigenous women to share both of our perspectives with you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much to both of you. Just again, invite people to drop questions into the chat. There are a few. So one just kind of basic question. What do you have a current number on how many Lumbees there are?
There's different numbers. So some people say 55,000, but I think and then the largest number people say is about 75,000. So it's probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
And then there are over 120,000 natives in the state in general.
Okay. Thank
It's
you.
almost like we have 50 to 60 some thousand that are actually enrolled. Like they have their tribal cards, they are actually on the rolls, but we have more people that live throughout the United States that aren't enrolled. So that number would be a bit inflated, you know, if you count all of the Lumbees in the United States. Yeah.
Thank you. So there were some questions about, so before the European introduction of Christianity, can you say a little bit about what the ideas were of creation and God?
Well, from my experience, and like I said, and it's the same with Brittany, is that we've grown up knowing Christianity. Like that's been the thing for us.
Mhm.
But it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I started learning about some of our roots as Tuscarora people, and then those Tuscarora creation stories. And so I think I saw a question about what's the difference in Lord and the Creator. Lord, I'm saying our Lord, Jesus Christ, our Heavenly Father. When I say the Creator, that's more of our traditional side. We just refer to it, I'm not even going to say a he or she, but that higher power as the Creator, the Great Spirit.
Right.
And in the Tuscarora creation story, and don't quote me on this. I don't want to get it completely wrong because I don't have a great grasp of it. But up in the sky world, there was essentially like mother nature, or sky woman. Sky woman essentially fell through a portal in the sky world because of conflict in the sky world. She fell through this portal and came down, and when she came down, she landed on a turtle's back. And when she landed on this turtle's back, she began to shuffle her feet. And that's how essentially Earth was created.
Mm.
Through her shuffling of her feet on this turtle's back. And that's where if you hear natives refer to the term Turtle Island, that's where that comes from. And some of the dances, the shuffle dance, references Sky Woman falling to the turtle's back and doing that shuffle to keep her feet on the back on that turtle shell. And that's how supposedly Earth was created.
I've also heard stories about Sky Woman too. I'm recently started reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. If any of y'all have heard of that, it's a beautiful book. And the author talks about Sky Woman being a part of her creation story as well. She's not Tuscarora. I think she's Potawatomi. But she talks about how Sky Woman is this woman in their tradition who's very revered and honored, and how all the animals came together to help her with her tasks that she had, and then comparing that in conjunction with the story of Adam and Eve, and how Eve immediately was created and then pretty much messed everything up for everybody for all eternity after that, and the differences between the first woman or the Sky Woman in general, and then Eve in I guess in, I don't want to call it European tradition, but in Christian tradition specifically, and how one woman is revered and one is reviled. One is considered good and honorable and noble, and the other one is considered, to be evil, or to have at least created an introduction for evil into the world. And so even thinking about it from that perspective shows you how, or at least gives you some insight into the different ways that Native women might have been in the past, at least been considered in their own communities, versus the way that women have been considered in the Christian tradition. And even thinking about the Bible, there's not that much inclusion of women in general, but in Native communities, women are so important, so centric to who we are. Even I always like to tell this story. My grandma and granddad were married for 50 years, but we always called their house Grandma's house. And my granddaddy would get mad because he's like, I'm the one paying the bills. I pay the mortgage. I pay the light bill. Like, my grandma didn't even know how much gas cost or milk or anything, because he paid everything. But we would still call it Grandma's house because it just was Grandma's house. I don't even know how to explain it, even though he is my granddad and I love him very much. It's just the matriarch is so important to Indigenous communities, even though Indigenous women have been increasingly disrespected with the introduction of colonization to America. So what Charlie just said is so spot on about thinking about Sky Woman, and then I always like to compare her to Eve. So.
And you've both kind of touched on this a bit, but will you say some more about, do you find that your Christian beliefs and your native spirituality enrich one another, or do you feel that they're more in conflict, or is it some of both?
I feel like they've enriched one another. And Brittany mentioned it. There are people that have different beliefs. It's almost like a sense of superiority. Like I know that whenever we dance in powwow is not just competition. It's almost like it's a ceremony. It's a very sacred. When you step into the circle, it's very sacred. And wearing the eagle feathers. When you see natives with feathers, a lot of times those just aren't feathers that they've just found wherever. A lot of times, especially if it's an eagle feather, that feather was given to them, and it has taken time for them to acquire those feathers. And the main reason being is because our people believe or honor the eagle for being the bird that flies the highest to the heavens, to the creator. And so that's why it's such a sacred feather. But I've heard people say some Lumbee, a Lumbee woman, and like Brittany was saying, so it's mostly our elders that have this kind of view. She said, our people didn't dance and wear feathers. We just didn't do that. As if, being Christian and in church was more superior than our traditional religion. But I feel that I've been enriched by both of them, and I try to have a balance with both of them. So I can't think of anything in terms of my traditional practices that would have a negative connotation to it.
I would say the answer from me is both. There are a lot of components of Christianity that I take umbrage with. I guess the thought of there being a hierarchy in the home, of the man being the leader and then the woman being subordinate or subservient to him. I take a lot of umbrage with that. I took a class on Paul when I was in undergrad, and so I have learned to consider Paul's Pharisee background when I'm reading Romans and Acts and whatever else that Paul wrote. And so I do that, but I do think that there are a lot of components, especially with the kind of church that I grew up in, which was, again, such a charismatic and very strict faith. There were a lot of components that I look back on now and I'm like, I cannot believe that was something that I took part in. I don't know, are y'all familiar with judgment houses? Have y'all ever heard of those before? That was a really popular thing to go to in my church, and it's like this play that you go to, and then there's two parts, or there's three parts. So there's like a car wreck and kids who are drinking at a high school party. And then immediately after that, there's a hell scene where half the kids who were drinking go to hell, and it's like horrible torture. And then immediately after that, there's the heaven scene where the good kids who weren't drinking go to. And then after that portion, a preacher comes out and people get saved. Most of the kids would get saved because they were but you didn't do it out of love for God, you did it out of fear for the hell scene that you saw. And so there was a lot of like kind of fear mongering in my church. Even now, I think I might have told you this last week, Ladane, but if I'm in a space and there's no people there, I think the rapture came. I got left behind. And if you're not familiar with the concept of the rapture, it's like when Jesus comes and takes up all the good Christians, and then everybody else gets left. And so I went into work last week and I didn't see anybody, and even though normally there's people, and I'm like, oh no, it happened, like the rapture came. And so I have some fear, honestly, or even maybe anxiety that's comical in a sense, that I think my church kind of created in me. And so I do have some I guess, reservations about Christianity, but more particularly, I think, in how it's been applied in America and how it's been used to justify slavery and colonization and removing Native people from our land and so many other horrible things throughout history. Not necessarily, I guess, with, or not fully, I guess, with the concept, but more so with the application and with the changing of the text throughout time.
Yeah, I feel like I have to step in at this point and say, like, I grew up Southern Baptist in Greenville, South Carolina, and so much of what you have shared sounds so familiar. And so I think, yes, I mean, I take umbrage with a lot of Christianity as well, even though I still very much identify as Christian. So do you know, like, were there people who were able to resist and maintain their native practices? Can you say anything about that?
Well, I can speak to the faction of Tuscarora people that live here in Robeson County. They go to Longhouse. They've still maintained some of their language. They're revitalizing their language. And Longhouse is it's just like like a long wooden structure, long rectangular structure. It's their church in a sense.
Mhm.
It's the equivalent of church, in which they go and do ceremony. I've never been, but there are still people here in Robeson County that have held on to those traditions that mainly identify as Tuscarora. Yes. And
I think there are definitely.
I'm just
Sorry.
so happy that they've preserved the language,
Mhm.
and sharing that as well. What were you going to say, Brittany?
I was going to say, I think especially for tribes out west, there are probably maybe even more preservation of
Yeah.
ancestral practices because they were later in being, I guess, introduced, if that's the nicest way to say, to colonizers. And so I know, for example, I don't know what tribe it is, I can never remember, but there was a popular indigenous practice called the ghost dance, which was a really important spiritual practice for a tribe out west. And that was made illegal in that state. And then many of their people ended up being massacred because of their practice of the ghost dance. And I think this all eventually led to the Battle of Little Bighorn, which a lot of people probably know about. And so even the tribes that have maintained this connection or some of their ancestral spiritual practices, it was still heavily criminalized at one point. It was not in their favor or in their benefit to practice those things. And Native people in the South were introduced to colonization first. And so we assimilated or were forced to assimilate a lot quicker than tribes who were out west did. And so upon first contact or upon first recorded contact with white settlers, people who are now known as Lumbee were already Christian and were already speaking English. And this is kind of known as the Lumbee problem because it's perplexing as to how we were already doing that in the 1700s. And it's confusing to a lot of historians and scholars. And so, but I do think that there are a lot of Native people so Native culture is generative and it's regenerative, and we can create traditions or get rid of traditions if we so choose. We're just like any other group of people. And so even though a lot of us may have lost touch with or I guess fully with a lot of the ancestral practices we had, there's a lot of talk right now in Native communities about reconnection or reconnecting to things. I listened to this beautiful podcast called All My Relations, and you probably heard Charlie mentioning the phrase all my relations earlier. And she talked about Native birthing ceremonies and how a lot of tribes traditionally would do ceremonies when a child was born. But some of these tribes don't know what they did anymore because it's not written down and because they were forced to stop. And so making the decision to say that just because it's lost doesn't mean I can't create something new. And it also doesn't mean that we can't remember. We can remember too. We have ancestral memory in our bones. We can tap into that and we can remember it, or we can create something new and better. And so I'm really interested in that piece, in the reconnecting and the remembering.
I love that. So kind of circling back to what we were just talking about as well, that so very much of what you're sharing resonates for me as a white Southerner. Can you talk, and Brittany, you and I talked some about this when we talked before, like, can you say a little bit about how you see the interplay between Lumbee culture and Southern culture?
Yeah, so this is something that I always like to mention whenever I do talks. It's just the concept that Indigenous people are the original Southerners. That's a phrase that Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry coined in reference to Indigenous peoples being, again, the original Southerners. And she says that we were here before something called the South ever existed. And so many things that people think are Southern are actually Indigenous. So, for example, grits were created by Indigenous people. Cornbread, our people cook with corn ancestrally, especially here in the Southeast. And so thinking about things that people think are Southern or our country are a lot of times Indigenous things. And so that's a really important point, I think, for people to realize. When I went away to college, people would hear me speak, and my accent, unfortunately, is a lot less Southern than it used to be, or a lot less Lumbee than it used to be when I speak in settings like this usually. But then when I go home, I'll code switch back to normal, I guess. And somebody said to me, there's no way you can be Native American. She said, you're too Southern. She said, Native Americans are supposed to sound mystical. So whatever that means. So she had obviously had this idea of Native people that was developed through movies, probably like Pocahontas or Dances with Wolves or Last of the Mohicans, which are all depicting Native Americans in the 18 or 1700s, and also portraying a particular type of Native that maybe never even existed, like with just always stoic and somber and sad and depressed. And so I don't see Native people being that way, especially not in the Lumbee tribe. And so she put that stereotype or that very rigid imagery onto me. And Southern Indigenous people do not look or speak or act in ways like a Native on a TV show like that, or even like a Native out West in general. Because even if you think about it from a state context, a North Carolinian is going to be pretty different from a person from California in the way they talk or behave or think. And tribes are also like that as well. And so we influence our context, and our context also influence us.
Charlie, you want to speak to that at all?
I don't have anything else to say other than that. That's it.
Sure. She nailed it.
Yeah, she nailed it. It's true, through and through.
So you were telling us a little bit about your earrings before we officially started, and I actually think it's kind of interesting. So can you talk about that?
Sure. They're pretty long, but they're dentalium shells. They're very light. They were handmade by a Lumbee artist by the name of Tabitha Jacobs. She's based in Greensboro. And so see, we've got, Lumbees all throughout the state, but this style and this shell originated from the tribes out in the Pacific Northwest, and it's made its way here to the East Coast tribes, just like powwows did. Powwows was a movement that came from the Plains tribes to the East Coast here, and it's something that's been adopted by all throughout Indian country. And I think I caught a glimpse of someone asking me if I had ever been to a longhouse. I haven't been in the longhouse to practice ceremony, but I have been in a sweat lodge for the purpose of, prayer and as a form of spiritual practice. So.
Somebody asked, what's the difference between tribe and nation?
I can speak to that. A lot of people, or I guess Indigenous people, will use the terms interchangeably. Some people don't like the term tribe because they think it portrays us in a primitive way. I personally don't feel that way. And some people like to use the term nation to just give us more legitimacy, or not give us more, but have us be seen as more legitimately. But also Native people, or a lot of Native people, consider themselves as citizens of their tribe. So just the same way that people consider themselves as citizens of their nations, but most Native people consider themselves as dual citizens of a tribe and also then of America or of Canada or from whatever other place that they're from. And so I use the terms interchangeably, but then some people again have preferences for either one.
Thank you. Are there,
I was just gonna say, when you get into talking about nations and tribes as nations, you dive into sovereignty and us being sovereign nations within this nation of the US. So
thank you. And this gets like, so Brittany was just mentioning the First Nations tribes in Canada, and you were talking about, you know, like earrings and powwows and different things crossing. So can you speak a little bit about like relationships between different Indigenous peoples? And I would think like throughout the US, but also there are Indigenous communities in Mexico and Canada. Are there, I mean, I know there are connections. Can you speak a little bit about those relationships? And
I just like to visualize, you know, go back to a time when you can think of the United States, Canada, and South America as, and when you look at it on a map, you'll see that turtle. You'll see that it looks like a turtle. And just envisioning our ancestors on these trade routes, migrating up and down when there were no borders, and just exchanging with one another, exchanging cultures and languages. And in terms of relationships within North Carolina, we have pretty good relationships. There's a little riffing between Lumbee and Cherokee out in the western part of the state, but for the most part, we have pretty good relationships with each other.
so on
Brittany?
Oh, no, I would just say the same thing that you just said. There's a lot of North Carolina natives that have relationships with each other amongst the different tribes. There are 8 state recognized tribes, but then the Tusk Aurora, like Charlie's been mentioning, is a group that's typically, there should be a term for it, that's recognized by natives as being native, even if they're not recognized by the state government. And so there are, again, 8 state recognized, and then there's the Tuscarora, which is recognized by other natives, and the Cherokee are also federally recognized, but I counted them in the 8. And so we do have a lot of relations, I guess, between the tribes and a lot of, I guess, collaborations as well.
Then when you think about the history of the Tuscarora, after the Tuscarora War in the 1700s, they split. And so some Tuscarora remained here in North Carolina, but the others migrated up to New York and sought refuge with there were 5 nations at the time, and now they're the Iroquois Confederacy, the 6 nations. And so they took them in, and that just speaks to the relationships there again amongst the tribes.
Matt is furiously trying to type a question, which looks super interesting.
I see a good question here, if you don't mind me answering it. I know we only have a few minutes left, but it says, what is the notion of sin in Indigenous people? I think that's a really great question, honestly, because the concept of sin in the Bible is so different from what I think would have been sin ancestrally in our communities. I took an Indigenous feminism class a few years ago, and it talked about how Native women ran the tribes pretty much, and they were the landowners and they were the centers of the family. But then with the introduction of Christianity, men slowly began to become more patriarchal and more controlling in the narrative, and even Native men, but also men from the outside. But also in a lot of tribes, there were not just 2 genders, there were 3 genders or 4 genders or 5 genders, and gender was this more of a fluid concept, or a more less restrictive concept than in traditional Christian religion. And so the concept, I think, of sin for Indigenous people would be, are you harming someone with what you're doing? Are you harming the environment? Are you harming another person? Whereas in the Christian tradition, it's more so are you doing something that is making people uncomfortable, or are you doing something that's deviating from this specific standard that we've outlined? And it's more, and that creates the opportunity for way more sins than an Indigenous community, which is much simpler format, I would say. So.
Charlie, did you want to speak to that one? No, she nailed it again. We're great.
Yeah.
Okay,
no.
so Matt has finally typed the question, so I think it's actually a really interesting one. So the question is, like, there are, more and more people immigrating from Mexico and Central America, and a lot of those are Indigenous people from those areas. Are there connections between, or are there growing connections between the communities? Are people reaching out? Is that happening between?
There is this concept of we didn't cross the border crossed us, which you hear in a lot in Indigenous communities. And like Charlie mentioned earlier, there were not borders in the ways that there are now, which are so restrictive, especially certain borders, the Mexican border being a lot more restrictive, unfortunately, than the Canadian one. And so I think that there is this concept of like relationality between all Indigenous peoples, but at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, we are still distinctive nations and tribes that have our own distinctive set of cultures and dialects and practices that are going to be really different from other people, but also still having a really core component of like super closeness with family and attachment and love for land and where your people are from. And so I think that there are certain characteristics that are really common to Indigenous people, but then there are also some ways that we're totally distinct and strange or odd or whatever, in distinction to one another.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So
Yeah, we're seeing a lot, here in Robeson County in general, a lot of immigrants that are coming here. They may be working on farms or however, but I think it's very interesting to see them, to see our cousins in school, to see them learning the languages, to hear them speak with a Lumbee dialect, I think is very cool. But at the same time, we are distinct communities.
Sure. So for the last question, I'm going to take us a completely different direction. This was one that was in the chat a while back. Can you talk about federal recognition and why that has taken so long?
Both of us will probably have a different perspective.
Different perspectives are welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very complicated answer and question. In Melinda Maynor Lowry, who I mentioned earlier, she has a book called Lumbee Indians: An American Struggle. And there's a quote in there, and I can never remember, it's between one and two people, and I can't remember who, so I won't say who or who it isn't. But they talk about how it's a particular form of cruelty for the same government that tried to get rid of you is now the government that recognizes you as Native. And so we see throughout American history this constant moving of the goalpost. And so them saying, oh, you can't speak your native language, that's criminal. You can't practice your native religion, that's criminal. You can't have your native land because we want it. But then now you have to prove these things in order to be considered Indigenous according to the federal government. You have to show proof of language. You have to show proof of connection to land. You have to show proof of culture or of like a long-standing ancestral culture. But these are the very things that they did not allow us or tried to force us not to have at the very least. And so it's almost like, how can we be federally recognized if those are the standards? And if our people have assimilated to survive, it is almost like a choice between survival or recognition, particularly again in a Southern context, I would say, particularly here. And so for Lumbee specifically, there's a dialect. I mean, some people would argue that we have a language, but there's no speakers of a traditional Indigenous language amongst the Lumbee people specifically. So we can't prove the things that the government's asking us to prove. But in 1956, the government did acknowledge that we're Indians, but that we're not entitled to any of the privileges thereof. So now, instead of going through the BIA like most tribes do to get acknowledged as being Native, and the BIA is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, now we have to go before Congress and they have to vote on it. And the closest we got, I think, was 2009, and it passed the House, and then it died in the Senate due to Republican opposition. So.
And my viewpoint has a lot to do with the Tusk Aurora history of North Carolina. And if we would really reveal how much of that blood runs through our people. And because the Tuscarora were such a strong opposition to the state during that time, I feel like we'd never be able to be recognized as such. I mean, the first time we petitioned as the Croatan Indians of Robeson County. And Croatan comes from a Tuscarora village on the East Coast. But that wasn't good enough. So we changed our name to something else. At one time, we were the Cherokee Indians of Robeson County. Indians of Robeson County. And then in 56, we settled upon Lumbee. And it's basically what Brittany's saying. We know you're Indian, but we're going to strip you of your identity. We're going to start with your language. I like to think that our people have pretty much always been here. You know, a lot of tribes, they were moved out west or moved to a reservation and they kept their culture. Our people haven't entirely lost our culture, but we have always kept our land. We've always been here in this part of the state. And it's just with that severance during the war, it's just going to be hard to gain that back. Unless we were to uncover that whole truth and essentially get rid of the Lumbee name.
Wow.
It's very controversial. It's very controversial.
Thank you. That's helpful. I mean, it's revealing. And
it has a lot to do with our religion and our ways of, it has a lot to do with us accepting Christianity and being assimilated, but thankfully we're here to tell the stories.
Right.
Amen and hallelujah.
Sorry, what's that?
I said amen and hallelujah.
Right.
So thank you both so much. I would love to hear just any closing thoughts you would like to share with us. And while you think about what that might be, I just want to say this has been so fascinating and so interesting. And I just appreciate you both. I know it's not easy to come and kind of bare your souls like this. And we are so grateful for you sharing your stories and your wisdom with us. So I'm going to let you have the final word. What's the final thing you would like to share with us?
Just love each other. It's really simple. Just continue to share love, the love of Christ, the love of the Creator. Just be good to one another. I don't know.
I would say just remember that Indigenous people are the original Southerners. And also that if you're interested in learning more about these topics, a great book is The Lumbee Indians: An American Struggle by Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry. If you want some TV shows that show Native people in a modern day light, which again, that's not a very common thing, there's a great one called Reservation Dogs. There's another one called Rutherford Falls. There's a great book that just came out last year that was on President Obama's book list, and it's called Firekeeper's Daughter. and they're making a show on Netflix about that. And so I would encourage you, I say all that to say, I would encourage you to seek out Native media and content that represents us in a positive, or not even positive, but in an accurate and a real representation of who we are, to kind of begin the work of deconstructing some of the stereotypes that unfortunately probably all of us here have internalized about Native people. And
Can
so
you
thank
mention
you
your
so much.
podcast?
Oh yeah, I have a podcast too. I honestly always forget when I do talks, but it's called the Red Justice Project. If y'all are, if you like to listen to stories related to true crime, and we cover in the podcast a lot of the crimes against Indigenous women that are happening in Robeson County, North Carolina specifically. And that county, in addition to being the largest and to being the most diverse, is also the most dangerous county in the state of North Carolina. And so there are unfortunately a lot of murders that happen there. And so we have a podcast on it called the Red Justice Project.
And
Thank
if
you.
any of you are interested in coming to church, would love to have you.
Yes.
So, come on.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. This has just been wonderful. We really, really, really appreciate your time and everything you've shared with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank y'all.
And thanks everyone for supporting the comparative religion program. Thank you. Thanks to our guests and thanks to our host tonight. And thanks to all the staff who make this possible. Thanks to all the volunteers on the comparative religion community, the comparative religion committee who've supported this program so well. And thanks to all of you in the community who've come out to see this tonight and share this great experience with us this evening. So on behalf of Temple Bethel, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.